American culture and Donald Trump in the year 2020. Welcome back to the conversation. I'm David Schuster. There is a terrific new book out about the way that artists and musicians and TV and videos and movies all came together to shape American culture in 2020, leading up to Donald Trump's failed re-election effort. The book is called Bloody Crossroads 2020. It was written by Danny Goldberg. He's a longtime been in the music business for a long time. He was the former manager of Nirvana. He's also an author. He is the president of Gold Village Entertainment. Danny, welcome to the conversation.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So your book points out that there was this unprecedented level of engagement from all of these different folks in Hollywood in terms of trying to stop Donald Trump. What was it about Donald Trump that prompted this?
Well, one thing was that he came from Hollywood himself. He was the host of a so-called reality TV show, and artists and entertainers know that reality TV has little to do with reality. And the idea that that kind of populist tabloid skill set could be used to seize political power, especially for right-wing ideas on a campaign that included a lot of racism and sexism, somehow galvanized a much broader section of the creative community than had been involved before. And it happened within days of his election. So, back in the previous decades, there were pop icons like Mariah Carey, Whitney Houston, Justin Timberlake. They never said a word politically. In the Trump era, you had Cardi B, Taylor Swift, Demi Lovato, the biggest pop artists, feeling some kind of compulsion to weigh in and to be part of the conversation. Because if showbiz techniques were going to control American culture and policy, they wanted in. And then you had older actors like Bette Midler and Robert De Niro, who previously had not been particularly political, who were suddenly tweeting every day. And then, of course, you had longtime activists like Jane Fonda and Mark Ruffalo and John Legend and Bruce Springsteen. You had virtually every late night comedian. When Jon Stewart started hosting the Daily Show in '99, he was the only one each night that was combining comedy with politics. During the Trump era, it was every show, every night. You had directors like Steven Spielberg and showrunners like producers like David Simon, producer of The Wire, who rushed into production, entertainment and art that commented on political morality that they felt was relevant in the context of the Trump era. So it just was part of the mix. I don't think that entertainers and artists were responsible for Biden's victory, but I think they were part of a coalition that was responsible. And I think they particularly played a role in trying to unite the left and the center. In 2016, the so-called third party vote was almost 5%. And that it went back down to 1.7% in 2020. And I think nobody's going to change their mind and like or not like Donald Trump or Joe Biden because an artist says so. But there's millions of people that were lukewarm about the idea of voting at all. And I think that artists and entertainers create a climate and created an added sense of urgency that helped turnout and engagement. And that's really a big deal these days when people pretty much are on one side or the other. It's just who shows up to vote. Usually.
So you see that as being the key cumulative effect, and that is people who may have just in previous elections said, I'm not going to bother. They feel it from American culture, from creative artists all over the place, and they think, okay, if it's important to them, and I know Bruce Springsteen or I know Cardi B or whatever it is, I know them from their music, and they're talking politics. Well, maybe that gives me cover to say, okay, I'm going to vote too.
I think it helped. I mean, the news media is so fragmented. Social media became so important. People like some of these artists had tens of millions of Twitter followers, far more than any Democratic member of Congress or political journalist. So I think it was another energy. My intent in the book is not to denigrate organizations like the ACLU or grassroots movements like Black Lives Matter or Democrats or their campaigners. It's just to recognize that there's another populist element that's required to make political motion in this era, that the Trump people had that. They still have it in a way that Democrats don't have unless they also broaden to include artists and unless artists are motivated enough to weigh in. I'm hoping next year they weigh in again because it's a little nerve-wracking today, the day after that Virginia race.
Yeah, the midterms were tough for Democrats. Do you see this perhaps also being a confluence of events that perhaps put a spark. Never mind Donald Trump and sort of what he did in terms of artists, but for example, just the circumstances of George Floyd and how gripping that was to somebody.
Oh, well, and COVID, when you had so many people at home watching their screens, the audiences for pop culture were greater. The moral reverberations of the murder of George Floyd obviously galvanized the country, and particularly young people and African American voters. Of course, for many, many years, hip hop artists had been doing songs about racist policing, and I think that created a climate where more white hip hop fans were sensitive to this in a way that they weren't in the 90s when the Rodney King tape happened. So I think that clearly two gigantic things that drove the culture were COVID and the murder of George Floyd, definitely.
You mentioned some of the folks that you interviewed: Bruce Springsteen, John Legend, Roseanne Cash, Chuck D, Mandy Patinkin. Was there anything that any of them said that took you by surprise?
You know, I asked Mandy, who I've known for quite a long time, why it was that artists tended to be on the left. It's not just during Trump. It goes back to Charlie Chaplin doing The Great Dictator. It goes back to Victor Hugo, Emile Zola, different countries, different generations. And he said that he felt the part of artists that became politically active for idealistic reasons was very similar to the part that drove some others to kill themselves. And that it was coming from such a deep place in him, who was such a successful artist and was extraordinarily active during the 2020 campaign cycle, doing many, many election-related videos. That really opened my eyes to another dimension of the whole phenomenon.
You spent, as I mentioned at the top, you were a former manager of Nirvana. You have spent a lot of time in the music industry. How have the political sort of machinations or the political activities, in your estimation, changed through the years?
Well, starting by the late 60s, artists were not being punished anymore for being outspoken politically. During the McCarthy period, they were, and hundreds of people were blacklisted and deprived of their careers. The power relationship changed, where artists were their success was dependent more on their fans than it was on so-called gatekeepers or moguls. But I do think the Trump era was a quantum change, again, because he came from show business, because racism was so much part of his campaign, that a wide array of artists who weren't previously that engaged felt it was kind of part of their job to weigh in. I do think that was a paradigm shift, and I think social media had a lot to do with it too, because the fragmentation of media, where TV networks don't have the audience they used to have, and Twitter has some of that, and entertainers are a little better at getting a lot of Twitter followers than pundits are.
For as long as I've been in the news business, and this goes back, decades, every time we would put on some sort of entertainer or creative type, there would always be some members of the audience who say, "Hey, why should I listen to a Bruce Springsteen or a John Legend or somebody like that? They're just musicians. What do they know about politics? I know as much as they do." Has that paradigm shifted a little bit in terms of giving more credit now to musicians and making it perhaps more okay for entertainers to dabble in politics and to be activists?
Well, it depends on who it is who's being skeptical. I mean, people on the right demonize performers except those that agree with them. You never hear them demonizing Kid Rock or Ted Nugent. I think that the idea of why should I listen to somebody? Well, maybe you shouldn't, but there are people that Cardi B can reach that are just not going to watch this program, or not going to read the Washington Post, or listen to NPR, or read The Nation or a right-wing blog. And getting information out is so important. I just heard about a poll that I think ABC did, that 69% of the public does not know what's in this so-called Build Back Better bill. Well, how on earth are Democrats going to win elections on something that people don't understand or know about? And how are they going to make people know about it? It's not so easy to do just with conventional political avenues. That doesn't mean that there aren't entertainers that are egotistical or stupid or say dumb things or make mistakes, but that's
there are journalists who are like that too, to be fair.
Of billionaires who have a great amount of influence on elections, and corporations, and owners of giant media companies, and labor unions, and so forth.
A question for you, and you mentioned the Democrats took a drubbing in the Virginia midterm, the gubernatorial race, an off year, not really midterm. There's a lot of fear, of course, about Donald Trump running again, about another Joe Biden-Donald Trump matchup. Do you see entertainers and creative types being as engaged the next time around as they were in 2020? And how do things have to change given that, look, Joe Biden's approval ratings are far lower than they were when he was challenging Trump in 2020?
Well, I think the incumbent always tends to take a lot of heat, and their approval ratings go down. But elections are about choices, not about whether you like or don't like one individual. I think the Democrats and the left and the center have to get the band back together and recreate that coalition. There's a lot of disagreements within the Democratic Party. I didn't support Joe Biden for the nomination. I preferred Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or Jay Inslee. He wasn't in my top three. But once he was the nominee, I think a lot of people coalesced behind him. And I think that the Democrats need to keep reaching out. They need spokespeople to explain what they're doing in a way that more than 30% of the public can understand. And artists need to, get back to the fight, because this is not going to happen without a recreation of that coalition. But it is worth remembering, we won in 2020. We don't have a lot of victories. And I think it's important to recognize that and to find out what worked and build on that instead of moping around.
Is there a sequel to your book coming in 2024?
I don't know. That would be up to my publisher, but I like writing books, so we'll see.
Well, and hopefully the next one, if you have to write it again, is of the Donald Trump Joe Biden sequel, in which Joe Biden again gets some help from entertainers and is able to keep Donald Trump from victory. But in any case, the book is Bloody Crossroads 2020. Danny Goldberg, he's a former manager of Nirvana. He's also an author. He's president of Gold Village Entertainment. Danny, thanks so much for doing this. Pleasure to have you on.
David, thanks so much for having me.
And that'll do it for this conversation. On behalf of Asher Cofield and John Skip Velacco, I'm David Schuster. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.